Our first presenter is Surya. He is already. Surya, are you able to hear us, please?
Very clearly.
Okay. Can we increase the volume of the? Can you speak, Surya, please?
Yes.
Is he audible to everybody?
Yes.
Okay. So let's get started, Surya. We see your screen
Okay.
with slide 1. Yeah.
Okay.
Go
Great.
ahead.
Great.
May I make a suggestion? Let the speakers briefly introduce themselves.
Sure.
So they-
Yeah. Please do introduce
Okay.
yourself, Surya, like we did
Okay,
yesterday.
okay.
Thank you for saying that. Please do introduce
Okay.
yourself before we
Okay.
get started. Thank you.
My name is Surya Kavuri. My full name is Venkat Surya Narasimham Kavuri, and turns out in the US you cannot put that name in social security system, so I become Surya Kavuri. I'm particularly first grateful that I'm given this opportunity to present in a conference like this, so thank you so much for that opportunity. I need to mention that I'm particularly thrilled because I'm at least virtually coming back to my alma mater after 30 years, so it's a wonderful experience. I'll get started. So the topic is, did Indian intellectual tradition hold the belief that all knowledge of practice is contained in Shastras? This is sort of an underlying theme in Pollock's 1985 Shastras paper, and Pollock says yes to the question. Now Pollock says that this belief crippled Indian intellectual creativity. He says that practice was reduced to merely discovering knowledge that's already present in Shastras. Pollock calls Shastras theories of practice, and he's clearly distinguishing between Veda Shastram and Shastras of practice. So these Shastras of practice, he says, he calls them theories of practice, and he says they restrain practice of theory. So in this paper, we critique Pollock's reasoning in answering the above question. So here is an outline of this morning's presentation. The critique focuses on 4 excerpts from Pollock's paper. These 4 excerpts together form a specific argument that Pollock puts forward. Now Pollock's argument can be presented in a simple form like this. Claim 1 was believed by Indian intellectuals to be true. Claim 2 was believed to be true. Therefore follows Pollock's conclusion. We follow that argument by giving a refutation as follows. Claim 1 was not believed to be true. Claim 2 was not believed to be true. Therefore, Pollock's conclusion does not follow. And we finally end the presentation with a conclusion that Pollock should have actually reached. So before we get into the details, let's take a quick summary view of Pollock's argument. This argument, if true, it uncovers a particular belief underlying Indian intellectual tradition. So claim number 1 is all knowledge pre-exists in eternal texts. Claim number 2 is Shastras are eternal texts for their practice. Now combining these 2 claims, he comes to the conclusion that all knowledge of practice pre-exists in Shastras. Here, of course, when I say Shastras, I'm only referring to Shastras of practice. Now, Pollock does not say anywhere that these claims are actually true in an objective sense. So, trying to come up with counterexamples to refute those claims is not going to help us refute his argument. So, what is important to Pollock's argument is that Indian intellectuals actually believe that these claims are true and therefore practically live by that conclusion. So, for us to challenge Pollock's argument, then we have to actually falsify the reasoning he uses to establish that Indian intellectuals believed those claims to be true. So that's what our approach will focus on. Now, this claim is so far-reaching that it kind of echoes throughout his paper, and we'll take a look at a few of the statements that he makes in his paper. For example, he says, under a relationship between theory and practice, Shastra and Prayoga, are diametrically opposed between the Sanskritic culture and what we find in the West. He says all Indian learning presents itself largely, so he's not saying every time, but largely as commentary on the primordial Shastras. Likewise, he says there is no practical value for experience, experiment, invention, discovery, and innovation. They pretty much become meaningless. He says that knowledge acquisition simply amounts to arriving at a closer and more faithful approximation to the divine Shastras. And he also says that there is simply no scope for progress through innovation. These are pretty far-reaching statements based on a very weak argument, and this seems to be a general trend in his approach. He likes to make universal claims, which is always a troublesome thing in an argument, but that's what he does. So we'll take a look at how Pollock first arrives at those two claims that he makes before we start the refutation. Let's look at claim number 1 first. All knowledge pre-exists in eternal texts. And Pollock presents this claim during his discussion of Sarkaryavada theory of causation. To quickly say what it is, in his words, all material pre-exists in some form because material cannot be created or destroyed. When we see a pot, it is really just a name and a form of clay from which it is made. In other words, pot, which is the effect, inheres in the cause, the clay. Now, so far so good. And one could even extend this to say that not only the effect, even the cause of knowledge exists in the cause. That's perfectly fine for us in explaining Sarkaryavada. But Pollock infers more from this. He says, as a pot, for example, must pre-exist in the clay, so knowledge must pre-exist in something. Then he says, we ourselves do not create knowledge, but merely bring it to manifestation from the textual materials in which it lies concealed from us. Now, while we are wondering where this word textual material comes from, he makes a reference to Shankara's Bhasya on Brahma Sutra 2.1.18, where Shankara discusses at length the Sarkaryavada theory. Claim number 2 says that Sastras are eternal texts for knowledge of practice. Now, if Sastras claim to be eternal texts and people believe, then that suits Pollock's argument. Now, Pollock presents Charaka Samhita as an example of such a Shastra, and Pollock actually presents what seems to be a very cogent reasoning, and it goes as follows. He says, Pollock is quoting from Charaka Samhita, a small brief quote. He says, starting point in the knowledge is authoritative instruction. At the next step, this authoritative knowledge has to be critically examined by perception and inference. Now, without there being some knowledge obtained from authoritative instruction, what is there for one to critically examine by perception and inference? When he reads this passage, he understands this to mean authoritative instruction first is more important than perception and inference. Second thing is perception and inference have only one role, and that is examining knowledge that is contained in authoritative instruction. And this falls exactly along the lines he is trying to portray in claim number 2. Pollock also presents a specific argument in relation to Charka Samhita, using its own words. And this reasoning too goes quite cogently, and it goes this way. Charka Samhita is an authoritative instruction. It holds that authoritative instruction is a pramana. Now, pramana is an independent means of knowledge. That is, a pramana cannot depend on other pramanas as its means of knowledge. But authoritative instruction can be ultimately traced to knowledge acquired by people by means of perception and inference. In other words, authoritative instruction cannot be a pramana. So to qualify as a valid pramana, Charka Samhita, the authoritative instruction, has no choice but to claim that it is beginningless. So for that reason, Charka Samhita has no choice but to claim divine origin. And then he says how Charka Samhita actually traces its origin to Brahma. Thus, Charka Samhita claims to be an eternal text of its domain. So these two sort of explain how he arrives at claim number 2. A quick recap before we move into our refutation. So claim number 1 is all knowledge pre-exists in eternal text. Claim number 2, Shastras are eternal texts for their practice of their domain. And the conclusion is all knowledge of practice pre-exists in Sastras. And if it pre-exists in Shastras, then all we have to do is simply search for that knowledge in those Shastras. We have really no need for any other worldly information. So all Indian learning presents itself largely as commentary on the primordial Shastras. Next, we go into refutation of Pollock's argument. Claim number 1, that all knowledge pre-exists in text, is wrong. Satkaryavada does not say anywhere that all knowledge pre-exists in text. Now, according to Satkaryavada, material cannot be created or destroyed. Therefore, all material pre-exists in some form. However, we cannot extend this logic to knowledge and say that all knowledge has to pre-exist in some form. Satkaryavada does not require knowledge to exist in some tangible form. More specifically, it doesn't have to exist in any textual form or written form or verbal form. Now, Pollock refers to Brahma Sutra 2.1.18, and in that context, he inserts the word textual. And he also refers to Shankara's Bhasya on Satkaryavada in this particular sutra. Now, if you look at what that sutra actually says, and I'm using Gambhirananda's translation of Shankara's Bhasya, it says, from reasoning and another Upanishadic text. Yeah, we see the word text right there, and it says from reasoning and another Upanishadic text, but we cannot infer that this sutra is saying knowledge comes from reasoning and another Upanishadic text. To clarify exactly what it means in its context, Gambhirananda specifies within parentheses, the pre-existence and non-difference of the effect are established. So pre-existence of effect in the cause and non-difference of effect and the cause are established from reasoning and another Upanishadic text. That's the way Gambhirananda wants us to read it. Now, his interpretation or the context that he's specifying is actually in agreement with what the previous sutras actually say. So that is quite valid. One more important point is Gambhirananda also clarifies that another Upanishadic text in this context means another passage, and it turns out based on Shankara's Bhasya that it is referring to another passage in Chandogya Upanishad. Now, why do they use the word another here, another Upanishadic text? Because Shankara refers to Chandogya Upanishad in his Bhasya on previous sutras, and he refers to a different passage from Chandogya Upanishad in his Bhasya on this particular sutra. So in that sense, the word text here has nothing to do with knowledge source where all knowledge pre-exists. So based on this, we can say that neither Satkaryavada Sutra or Shankara's Bhasya even remotely suggests that knowledge pre-exists in text. So I have no idea how Pollock sees reasoning, sees textual material in this particular discussion. Now, claim number one can be looked at another different way using the concept of pramana. And our refutation here is pramana and not text are the means and the authority of knowledge. So knowledge or prama has only one valid means. We call that pramana, the means of knowledge. So there cannot be multiple means, and that one means becomes the authority. There are three valid means of knowledge that are relevant in this discussion. They are direct perception, pratyaksha pramana, inference or anumana, and authoritative testimony, which we call text in this paper of Pollock's. Now, critical to, we won't get into details of pramana theory here, but critical to highlight three important points. The first one is pramana cannot depend on other pramanas. So there can only be one means of knowledge, and these means of knowledge have to be independent of each other. And that one independent pramana will be the authority of a given prama. An obvious example to give based on our personal experiences is one like this. If house is on fire, we don't need to wait to look up a text to confirm it. We can run to the exit. Now, human knowledge cannot grow without authoritative testimony. This is our own personal experience. Each and every person cannot simply rediscover every scientific claim, for example. So, authoritative testimony is something very important, and we need to consider that as we look at Pollock's commentary on this. Now, claim number 2 says that Sastras of practice claim to be eternal texts for their respective domains, and that is wrong, because Indian tradition is very clear on boundaries of authority of knowledge. An exemplary discussion of this topic is by Adi Shankara himself in his Bhasya of Bhagavad Gita 18.66, where he says, 100 Shrutis may declare that fire is cold or that it is dark, still they possess no authority in the matter. Shankara actually goes on to say that authority in this case belongs to direct perception. Shruti cannot simply claim any authority here. So the important takeaway here is that the issue is not whether all knowledge is in text, but whether texts have authority on all knowledge. And Shankara is saying emphatically that it is not. It does not. A second point worth mentioning is that Indian intellectual tradition places two conditions on revealed truth. This comes from Hiriana's wonderful book. And the two conditions are, the first one is the revealed truth should be extra empirical, alaukika. It needs to be unattainable through other pramanas. So again, this is a point about independence of pramanas. And the second criteria condition is revealed truth should not be contradicted either by other pramanas, for example, our own direct perceptual experiences or reasoning, or by itself, abhadita. So these are two very important conditions that we see our Indian intellectual tradition historically use and testing revealed truth. Claim number 2, that Shastras of practice claim to be eternal texts, we say is wrong because authoritative instruction according to Charaka Samhita does not mean a beginningless text. Pollock selectively quotes from Charaka Samhita as we saw. It appears as if Charaka Samhita is placing itself above direct perception and reasoning, and it appears to say that direct perception and reasoning have nothing to do but merely examine knowledge in authoritative instruction. But that is a misread that we do because Pollock selectively picked a small quote. But if we go on to see what Charaka Samhita says, it, for example, gives a very clear definition of what authoritative instruction is. It says it comes from authoritative persons. It doesn't come from some eternal text. It comes from authoritative persons. It says authoritative persons are those who possess undisputed knowledge. And it says that these people should have good memory and are not affected by irrational and subjective factors. There is simply no scope for interpreting this to mean unbroken instruction or some prior beginningless text, as Pollock seems to infer. In fact, contrary to Pollock's presentation, Charaka Samhita is practical to its core. It says, for example, that all three pramanas, direct perception, inference, and authoritative instruction are needed to do diagnosis. It very clearly says that. In fact, it says for a competent person, authoritative instruction is optional, but not direct perception and inference. So clearly, Pollock has selectively picked some text from Charaka Samhita and left out a whole lot of important text to misrepresent it. But before I move on, while we establish that the source of authoritative instruction is human beings and or competent authoritative persons, we bring ourselves a new problem, and that is, if authoritative instruction is from people, source of that knowledge should be traceable to direct perception and inference, as Pollock pointed out. So how then can Charaka Samhita claim to be a pramana? Is Charaka Samhita stuck in a paradox, as Pollock says? We address that point next. So there is really no paradox in saying that authoritative instruction is an independent pramana. In fact, even if we look at contemporary philosophy of medicine, they clearly hold that authoritative testimony is indeed an independent pramana. And a particularly interesting book is the Handbook of Analytical Philosophy of Medicine by Sastras A, who has been working on this research for the last 30 years, so he's written quite extensively. And he makes commentary that sounds like he took right out of our own intellectual tradition. For example, he says a medical journal article that's multi-authored these days can have as many as 100 authors or even more. Each member of that research team is told by other members that things are such and such. There is no way that any one of these authors can go and check the actual details of every one of them. They simply have to take the testimony to be true. Even in lab research, the primary source of modern scientific knowledge, there is no escape from reliance on prior testimony. We cannot go into a lab and start doing experiments or doing research without taking prior knowledge into account, and that's what we mean by prior testimony. And source of testimonial knowledge, and this is a very interesting and important point, is not experience, memory, or reasoning, but a community. So it is a social society that is providing the source, not direct perception or reasoning. So we cannot trace all the way back down to that level because that information will simply be not there. So testimonial knowledge then cannot be reduced to evidential knowledge. In fact, Sadiq Zadeh goes on to say in his book that without testimonial knowledge, medical knowledge as we know simply could not exist. So what that means is, yes, authoritative instruction does not need to be beginningless text in order for it to be an independent pramana. It can come from competent persons, that is fine, but it is still a valid pramana. Now, Charaka Samhita claims divine origin, so we need to address that topic as well. And the point here is that it's really not a practical issue anymore. Why? Because the claim of divine origin is not necessary for Charaka Samhita to be an authoritative testimony, as we just discussed. Now, does the claim of divine origin mean that it cannot be questioned? Clearly not. Again, Charaka Samhita tells us that authoritative instruction is from competent man, and knowledge from man can be revised and updated. So there is nothing that says that it cannot be questioned. So this claim of divine origin is not important to establish its importance. So then why claim a divine origin? And at least I personally see three reasons in three different ways. One is they are merely asserting Sarkaryavada, not just effect, even causal knowledge inheres in cause. In fact, all knowledge, as with all matter, inheres in Brahman. So claiming divine origin is just a restatement of Sarkaryavada. The second reason is cultural respect for knowledge. Indian culture is an intellectual culture. It respects knowledge. So no surprise that knowledge is treated as divine in origin. And finally, an instrumental value. Claiming divine origin ensures that its role as a pramana is recognized and respected. So, in conclusion, pramana is the authority of knowledge, not text. Shruti texts are not authority of knowledge of practice. It is whichever pramana is responsible for that particular prama, that is the authority of knowledge. Direct perception, inference, and authoritative testimony are all indispensable means of practical knowledge. Shastras of practice are authoritative testimonies. Sastras such as Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita. Collective human knowledge, for example, of medicine, cannot grow without authoritative testimony. Authoritative testimonies are ultimately human and subject to corrections, revisions, and additions. I don't think Indian intellectual tradition has any issue with that as far as Sastras of practice are concerned. So considering knowledge to be divine is a testament to an intellectual culture. To read something else into it is just a travesty. So that concludes my presentation for this morning.
Excellent.
Thank you for this session, for this presentation.
I am Professor V.N. Jha. Thank you very much for making this excellent presentation.
Thank you, Professor Jha.
You have made it so clear. I am a trained Nayayika, and
He's done it.
you have exactly followed the method followed by Nyaya, and so I am so happy. The point that you have highlighted, that the texts do not have authority on empirical knowledge. Exactly, this is what is to be underlined, and this is what he perhaps Pollock wanted to conceal and distorted it by quoting selective passages. And so I am very happy that you pointed out. Actually, this was already done in the tradition long before. And therefore, Shastra was divided into two categories, Paurusheya and Apaurusheya. So, in the area of Paurusheya Shastra, the Shastra need not be Sotah Pramana. Uh, I do not know whether you were, I mean, Pollock has quoted Jayanta Bhatta, Nyayamanjari. And in Nyayamanjari you will find that Jayanta has, mic on? Hello?
We need a new mic. Mic? I think the battery's out.
Why a sentence is dependable and why a sentence is not dependable. This has been the topic of discourse in 9th century by Jayanta Bhatta in his text called Nyayamanjari. Now, it is not that all philosophical systems believe that the Veda is apaurushaya. For instance, Nyaya does not believe that it is apaurushaya. And therefore, in order to establish Nyaya theory, Jayanta Bhatta has initiated a discourse on this and comes to final conclusion that why is it that some sentence is dependable and even at empirical level, not trans-empirical level, but even in empirical level, how to distinguish a person, how to distinguish a sentence which is dependable and a sentence which is not dependable. And ultimately he comes to the conclusion that it is the if the sentence happens to be an apta, so apta vachanam pramanam. And what is an apta? Who is an apta? Apta is a person who knows the truth. And not only he knows the truth, he has an intention to share that truth with others. Apta, you may have knowledge, but still it may mislead.
But this is not empiricism, sir.
So,
This is anti-empirical. This position is anti-empirical.
so unless you are an apta, apta implies that you should have the knowledge of the truth and you have a desire to share. So he should be karunika. He should be compassionate to share the knowledge of the truth with others. If such is the person and if the statement is from such a person, that statement becomes dependable, and in other cases it is not dependable. And exactly taking this parameter into view, the Shastra was divided into Paurushaya, not in the terms of Paurushaya and Apaurushaya, but in the terms of Aptavachana or Anaptavachana. So Aptavachana is Pramana and Anaptavachana is not Pramana. I think Surya has brought out this so nicely, though he did not refer to the theory of Nyaya, but certainly he has brought out by taking into account the Charaka's argument that so far the empirical knowledge is concerned, this is a pointer. I think it settles the cloud, it removes the cloud that Pollock wanted to create by selectively quoting some position and saying that all Shastras are Anadi, all Shastras, all knowledges are in the Shastra. So this has been made clear. So I must express my happiness and thank you once more. Actually, what is happening is there is a dictum that naso sthanor aparadha yadi andhuna pashyati. It is not the fault of the post that a blind man hits it. You do not have maybe sometimes you may pretend that you do not have eyes, but even after eyes, if you do not see, it's something more dangerous than a blind man hitting a post. I think this kind of an approach of study of Shastra is very dangerous, and we should not encourage it. So thank you.